this whole business of American neutrality is looking pretty flimsy at this point. It's clear that the Americans are on the British side.
Pearl Harbor's a vanity project for the Imperial Japanese Navy, in my view. They want to show what they can do.
I am far more certain that any sort of offensive activity, any dead American boys, you've got a war.
Okay, well, let's start talking about the big what-ifs. Had Pearl Harbor never happened, Chris Parry, had the Japanese decided against it, what are the long-term consequences? Does the US even enter the Second World War?
Well, I think we said earlier, and Jonathan's actually confirmed it, is that had the Japanese attacked the Philippines, which they did, had they taken Guam, Wake Island, then the Americans were pretty much committed. They were also committed to their allies, the Dutch and the British, to get involved. And I think the American balance would have been, if we don't get involved now, when is it going to be? When the Japanese are really far forward? So if we don't actually engage, then it's going to be a problem for us, because the ability to react would have been very, very short, to tell you the truth, in those circumstances. The important thing, of course, is would Roosevelt have got it through Congress without the shock of Pearl Harbor? It may be that people in Congress would have thought, well, okay, Philippines are way over there. Is that a big deal? I think enough American assets in terms of the land forces, the aviation, the Asiatic fleet that was sitting in the Philippines would have been engaged. A lot would have been going on around them. And I suspect Congress would have passed that even without the attack, to tell you the truth. I don't think it makes a difference. I think where it has made a 100%. Difference, where it has made a difference, it is that the Japanese actually thinking that actually this would be a knockout blow. It hasn't been. And the army in Japan immediately says to Yamamoto, well, that didn't work, did it? And so they lose a bit of faith in the Navy's ability to actually do this strategic stuff at this point. And of course, what it leads directly to later, as Jonathan hinted at, is the ability of the Americans not only to start the campaign in the Pacific, but also defend the Australia-America link that is so vital. It means because the carriers aren't in Pearl Harbor, they can engage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Guadalcanal campaign is possible, and more importantly, Midway as well. I mean, what I find interesting is the original Japanese plan actually had an invasion force attached to it as well. And had the Japanese followed this up, and given the supply difficulties and the overcomplicated plan that the Japanese had, that's probably not viable. So they were sensible to make that. But what if they'd had an invasion force alongside this attack? What would have happened? So, the Japanese front line would have been far forward, but they rejected that.
John, where do you stand on an invasion?
I am profoundly skeptical of that. You're right that some versions of the Navy plan had in mind that, yes, we'd like to take Oahu, but the Army was never going to go for that, because the main thrust of this war is to the south. Correct. And the Japanese only have a certain amount of amphibious lift capability. They can only move around about 2, maybe 3 divisions at a time. And so if you come to me and say, hey, I want to invade Hawaii, something's got to give, and that means that then they probably don't have the lift to put the initial group of troops into Malaya, which is kind of the crucial ground campaign at the beginning of this war, is to take Singapore. And, then do you end up not getting the result where you end up getting the oil? Because if you give the British more time to build up in Malaya, among other things, the 18th Infantry Division is on ships and ends up getting landed in Singapore just days before the actual historical collapse. And so you could get a much more protracted ground campaign here, which maybe ultimately doesn't end up getting you the oil that you went to war for in the first place. So I discount that they would have actually gone for an invasion attempt against the Hawaiian Islands, because Hawaii, there ain't no oil in Hawaii, and that's not the main reason we're going for war.
Well, as we're talking about the wider region, let's zoom out again. Let's look at the Pacific and let's explore some more what-ifs. Well, we're looking at the wider Pacific region now. I think what's really interesting is are we almost saying, Dr. Chris Parry, that any attack on Pearl Harbor would have prompted Roosevelt to push for a declaration of war? Whether that would have been approved or not is a big question. But realistically, the Americans are triggered into declaring war on Japan the moment the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor.
No, I think any attack by the Japanese on anything that relates to vital American interests triggers the war, to tell you the truth. Pearl Harbor's a vanity project for the Imperial Japanese Navy, in my view. They want to show what they can do. They want to take out the American battlefield. There's a fundamental misunderstanding about the American psyche here. The Japanese think the Americans are soft, they're weak, they're decadent. They're not going to respond if we give them a knockout blow. It's a bit like Barbarossa, really. We'll give them a punch, everything will collapse. Well, didn't happen. Right. The Americans are absolutely energized and empowered by it. But the fact of life is, had the Japanese attacked the Philippines, Guam, or Wake Island, you might have got away with it. I don't think the American Congress would have gone to war over Wake Island, but certainly the Philippines. And I think at some stage the Americans would have made the assessment: look, the Japanese are on the war path. They mean war in our direction. We've got all sorts of issues in the Central Pacific that we need to resolve in relation to where they're building airfields and things like that. We've got to maintain the link with Australia. And in any case, a lot of our war plans say we're going to go through the Central Pacific and also up through the South Pacific as well. So if it's going to happen, let's do it at a time of our strength, not at a time when the Japanese are really on top.
John, let's bring you in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say I am far more certain that any sort of offensive activity, any dead American boys, you've got a war. And one of the classic conspiracy theories about this whole thing is, that this was a plot by Roosevelt. If I let them attack Pearl Harbor, that'll bring us into the war. Man, I'm here to tell you there are a lot more efficient ways to going about getting a declaration than having half your battle fleet wrecked in a harbor. All you would have needed to do is send one American destroyer out of the Philippines to snoop some of those invasion convoys that were moving south to places like Malaya, and the Japanese are going to sink that ship, and you've got yourself a war. Certainly any direct attack against the Philippines. We have an entire division in the Philippines and a lot of aircraft and submarines too, as Chris noted. You attack the Philippines, you've got a war for sure.
I think the critical thing here, James, is the effect on the broader tripartite alliance. Because after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler says, right, we're going to declare war on the United States. He didn't have to do it. He did not have to do it. And so we get a critical situation where Roosevelt actually gets both wars he wants, against Japan and against Germany. And of course, at the Atlantic Conference between Churchill and Roosevelt, they'd already agreed that we'd go Germany first. But how on earth does Roosevelt convince people that Germany first is going to be the strategy without Hitler actually declaring war himself? I mean, it's absolutely fatal. What I think is really interesting here is that coincident with obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor, or indeed anywhere where the Americans are engaged, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. Absolutely astonishing move when his troops are bogged down, as we know, on the Eastern Front in Barbarossa just before Moscow. We've got a lot going on in North Africa, of course, ahead of what we know as El Alamein. And so right at the point where Germany is really, really sort of up to its neck in things, they declare war on the United States with its vast industrial and manpower capacity. Of course, it was in honouring the tripartite pact that Hitler did it. But it has an immense effect, of course, on the strategy of the war. It gives leadership to the Americans immediately because Hitler decides on a whim that he's going to declare war on the United States.
I mean, that is so interesting. And in a way, maybe that's the key thing about Pearl Harbor. It's not so much whether the attack could have played out differently. It's more the fact that once it happened, the various responses from the US and from the Axis powers, etc. I mean, let's say, for example, John, Hitler does probably what would have been the strategically wise thing and doesn't declare war on the US. I think we all know that. Then what happens? I mean, presumably Roosevelt has to pursue the Pacific first.
Yeah, which from Churchill's standpoint is a bad thing. I mean, the last thing that the British want is to have the American attention yoinked over to the Pacific and start ignoring what's going on in Great Britain. And so, yeah, Hitler gives Roosevelt a tremendous political gift when he decides to, actually declare war. But to that point, I would say that the U.S. is eventually going to be in a shooting war in the Atlantic in any case. We're already taking pot shots from German U-boats. They've sunk one of our destroyers, the Reuben James. That happened just a couple months ago. And so I think eventually you're going to get a situation where we're going to make the decision, okay, the Germans are still taking pot shots at our destroyers. We need to get in this thing, and we're going to get a war out of that in any case. Because among other things, Admiral Donitz, the head of the German submarine force, he too has got spittle running down his chin. He wants to make the Americans fight for the sea lanes. This whole business of American neutrality is looking pretty flimsy at this point. It's clear that the Americans are on the British side. So I think there's going to be a war with Germany. I just don't know when that's going to happen.
And very briefly, John, if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, you still get the nuclear arms race. Does the bomb get dropped?
Yeah, on somebody. Yes, because
I think there's another
that decision's already been made.
I think there's another issue.
We're already getting into that game.
I think there's another issue here as well, of course. If this attack on Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, you actually have Admiral Kimmel in place as the Pac Fleet commander. You also have Admiral Betty, as he was known, Betty Stark, as the Chief of Naval Operations. Now, they were replaced respectively by Admiral Nimitz and also by Admiral King, who I very much admire. Fantastic strategic thinker.
So does Midway play out differently?
Well, does the Pacific War play out differently? And do these personalities have enough sort of willpower to stand up to General MacArthur, who is the major domo in the South Pacific? So the whole personality issue associated with this, I would say, and forgive me, obviously I'm not an American, the Japanese do you a favor by attacking you at Pearl Harbor, because not only does it get you in the war with real grievance, but also replaces your top naval commanders with seriously good people who can then take on the Pacific campaign.
Yeah,
100%.
You agree with that, John?
Absolutely in agreement with. Oh, completely. If you look at the caliber of the two people that we end up putting into those two roles, they are immensely superior to, Betty Stark and Admiral Kimmel.